are you, and what do you do?
Well, I'm still finding out who I am, but formally I'm a Franciscan. Now, we're the first group that came to these beautiful California shores in the 18th century, so that'll just situate the community that I'm a part of. And I know some people love our 21 missions that dot your coast, and some think we came to oppress. I hope that wasn't true. But in fact, the whole vision of Francis was to live among the marginalized, to take care of the people who've been in any way excluded, and to give them preferential treatment. So the reason we came here to California and to New Mexico, where I live, was actually in our minds at that time to help those people who were treated like nobodies, the native peoples. But the Franciscans educated me. I joined when I was very young. I'm in my 75th year now, and believe it or not, I joined when I was 19, which was traditional at that time. They'd get you very young before you'd meet girls and before you... It was pretty terrible, really, but I can't complain. I've had a wonderful life. And I ended up being allowed to preach, teach, really around the world for most of my life.
So at the early age of 19, 20, 21, or did you spend a time as, what would they call it, learning the priesthood?
Sure. Well, not priesthood. First I became a Franciscan, so that you become a novice, where you're trained. It's sort of like boot camp, where you get the full message in all of its expectation and see if you can do it. Then I had 4 years of philosophy, then I had 4 years of theology, but the real seminary, and then I was ordained. Many years later, I became a priest. But the real seminary was those later years when I was meeting real people and seeing that my idealized theology that I'd been trained in books really didn't work most of the time with real people. And so that became the meaningful seminary, I think, when I really began to talk to individuals, giving retreats and counseling and so forth.
And you felt a natural ability to share this knowledge, this wisdom that you had kind of accumulated through books, through theory, and able to share in an experiential way were you sharing with Catholics at this point?
You know, certainly in the early years, it would have been mostly Catholics who would have invited me. I had no public name, I had no credibility. But then the audiences kept widening, I think it's fair to say. As other people said, well, this makes sense. I hope that's what they felt. And you don't have to be a bona fide Christian, much less a bona fide Catholic. You know, one of my major themes is, if it's true, it's got to be true everywhere. I mean, that's sort of common sense. That's what makes it true.
Right.
It's a universal pattern. And, you know, to use that word Catholic, since you used it, that was taken by the early Christians already in the year 108, that early, because as this man Ignatius of Antioch is traveling from Antioch to Rome to be martyred, he's traveling through all these villages and states of what is now Turkey, would have then been Asia Minor. And he feels already in 108, he's finding tribe after tribe, group after group, is joining this new movement, and that's all it was at that point. And he said, this is going to be a universal movement. It's a universal truth. Now, that's what the word Catholic means. And it's so ironic that what was first a universal
108 is 108 years after the death of Christ?
Well, Jesus died around 33, so 70 years.
70 years after.
Yeah, 70 years after the death of Jesus.
Is
We're already calling ourselves a universal religion.
Okay.
Now, that's so strange that we regressed in many ways. We became tribal. I just finished a book where I was able to point out the three fathers of the church, Augustine, Eusebius, who was the third one? Can't remember right now. All agreed that what is now called the Christian religion was truth that existed before Jesus. Do you understand? And all Jesus is doing is coming and personifying it. You understand? Living it. It's natural theology. It's natural truth. Now, I know that's hard for most people to believe because most of us started like you did as an Episcopalian. Did you begin also in a
Baptist?
Oh, even more so. Where we began in our tribes, and I did too. We called ourselves Catholic, but any of your audience who were raised Catholic like I was, you know, it was much more Roman than it was Catholic. And in many ways, Roman Catholic is an oxymoron, you understand? So is Anglo-Catholic. It's contradiction in terms. If you're Catholic, you're not ethnic. Yeah.
At what year did all of a sudden we grab a pope and cardinals and elders and build a hierarchy inside this universal
Yes.
truth?
Well, the big year of transition, where it really starts, is 313. I'm sure you heard me talk about that
Yep.
before. In the year 313, after the first 3 centuries of largely living underground as the persecuted minority, you know, there's nothing worse than becoming the dominant consciousness, the majority. Once you become the majority, you lose your self-critical thinking. You really do. You see, any dominant group, forgive me, but is normally corrupt within one generation. We can't handle power. Most people can't. So in the year 313, we almost overnight moved from the catacombs, underground, literally, to the basilicas, which is the Italian Roman word for palaces. We became the established religion. So from being the persecuted group, we became the established group. And that begins our love affair, our identification with power, empire. Like when we Franciscans here came to the California shore, we couldn't distinguish ourselves from the Spanish Empire. You understand? Which made us make a lot of mistakes. We became more true to empire, imperial thinking, which is always meritocracy, and we'll talk about that later, I presume, based on earning it, improving yourself in power and money and so forth, instead of the gospel, which is an entirely different economy than meritocracy.
And St. Francis of Assisi, what year was he?
So he dies in 1226.
So we've had 1,000 years of, can we call it Catholic tradition?
Yes.
Roman Catholic building of this.
They call themselves the Universal Church, the one holy universal church. That's still said in the creeds. But the power center becomes Rome, because that was the Roman Empire, became the Holy Roman Empire. For our protection, we identified with that power system. And that, you asked at the beginning, things like cardinals and the whole moving into a pyramid shape. That is strongly taking over in the 11th and 12th centuries, right before Francis.
Okay.
So Francis has sometimes been called the last Christian, because he saw, it seems, what was coming and just entirely went the other direction.
That's where he identified with the poor.
The little guy.
Back to the person who's been persecuted, where we
That's-
started.
There you got it. There you got it. Because the church at that point was so identified with the upper class, the imperial systems of this world, which we have remained to this day.
Right.
And I think that's why so many people are so critical of Christianity. That Jesus always seems to lose out. If we have to choose between power and powerlessness, as the 12-step people would put it, who wouldn't choose power?
Right.
Right.
So, for the most part, and that's true of every denomination. Maybe small groups like the Anabaptists, the Amish, the Mennonites, the Quakers, they succeeded to some degree not identifying with power, to a good degree in several cases. But most of us were part of the system.
So you made this conscious decision to understand, I think I see a different way of seeing things, and that's what I want to share. So you started writing and speaking on that. You formed the Center for Action and Contemplation. Tell us a little.
That came much later.
So you started writing and speaking first.
No, I didn't write my first book till the late 80s. I was
How
more
old were
known
you?
as a preacher and teacher the first
Wow,
years. When
I
I was
didn't
on
know
the road,
that.
I'd just get up and talk.
Okay.
You know. And then my early books, they're sort of phony, really, because people would transcribe my lectures from a weekend and make them into a
And
book.
turn it into
and
a
put
book.
my name on the cover. Do you understand?
Wow.
And you can see the difference in my early books.
Mm-hmm.
They're sort of the way you talk and sort of not real ordered. My later books, I'd like to believe, are better written.
Mm-hmm.
More because I matured and learned how to formulate my thoughts a little better. I hope also that it got more integrated inside of me too.
Mm-hmm.
But first I was a teacher. Now they used to introduce me the first 10 years as the tape priest. Now I know you're too young to remember this. But in 1973, I was ordained in 70.
Okay.
The cassette tape was newly invented, all right? This is the latest technology on the road, you know.
It's cutting edge.
Cutting edge, the cassette tape. And it just so happened to coincide with, I gave in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I was at that point. I was trying to interest Catholics in Scripture. Because most Catholics, because we were formed in the pre-literate period of Christianity, before the invention of the printing press, which is why the written word so much influenced Protestantism. Because you came along when the written word came along. We didn't have the written word for 1,500 years.
You shared through storytelling.
Storytelling, art, music, theater. That was the Catholic mind. It was much more right-brained, which Protestantism has never understood. They think we're all heretics and we don't know Jesus because we don't do it their way, you understand? But it's because we came out of a different history. But nevertheless, I agree that what the Protestant Reformation necessarily brought was critical scriptural critique of some of that right brain, mythological, symbolic, statues everywhere, and all the stuff that you identify with Catholics. We wanted to bring good scripture to that, and that was my background, was to teach scripture to Catholics.
So if I'm understanding this, the Protestant movement was much more logical or practical or logos, and it was trying to translate mythos or art.
Excellent, you
or
understand. That's exactly right.
The storytelling.
That's right.
And through that, it became more judgmental. It became more right, wrong,
Remember,
black, white.
It's always good and bad.
Right.
Protestantism brought the critical thinking, but it also brought highly judgmental thinking.
Yes.
And the two sides of the same coin. Very moralistic. The last 500 years of Christianity are much more moralistic than we would have been in the first 50
You're
years.
good or bad
Yeah,
based
you're
on
in
how
or out.
much you pray,
Yeah.
how little bad things
Yeah.
you did, how loving you were,
Yeah,
how much
that's
you
right.
served, how much you volunteered.
How much you
That's
gave.
where the system of meritocracy,
Meritocracy.
your value
Yeah.
as a human and your value in God's eyes was on how much you performed, the works that you did based on this logical set of rules
Yeah.
that the Protestant religion kind of outlined.
And I don't want to blame it all on Protestantism.
No.
We had Dante, the Inferno, we were already setting you up in this direction. But you really took it home in terms of, basically being willing to condemn most of what God created to eternal hell because you didn't make a personal decision for Jesus.
Right.
We
Right.
never went that far. We had all kind of ways around that, you understand? So it became much more what I call dualistic thinking. And dualistic thinking, I'm going to make a strong statement, but it's the death of religion. It's the death of any religion. Because you can't leave the field open. And unless you leave the field open, God can't get to you. Once you've set it forward in terms of two alternatives, and thinking because you chose one of the alternatives, you're right. This is really a recipe for disaster.
Which makes the other one necessarily
Wrong.
Evil, wrong, yeah. And now this has invaded all of Western civilization. Look at our politics. We think we're a wise country because we have Republicans and Democrats, And people are hesitant to imagine any notion of gender between total heterosexual and total homosexual. That's the way we like to frame reality, do you see? And it gives the ego comfort. It
Yeah.
does. I sort of like it too,
Right.
'cause, you understand? But it doesn't give you wisdom. Wisdom is much more subtle thinking, much more compassionate thinking. It takes you a while to get to that.
And that would be, you've used power, prestige, and possessions is kind of the direction that we're naturally drawn. That's what we're rewarded for. That's what kind of society pushes us towards. And on the other side would maybe be empathy, gratitude, and love, which is maybe vulnerability, authenticity has been somewhat lost because of this pursuit of power, prestige, and possessions. At what point did you become controversial to the did you start controversial to the Catholic faith, or did you start poking holes in the Protestant system of meritocracy?
Oh no, it was never my place to critique Protestantism. We had enough to critique in my own camp, you know.
Because you are controversial within the Catholic tradition.
Yeah, but they've sort of given up on me because I'm so old now and I've been around so long. I don't get much pushback anymore. And I'd like to believe, and I know this from some bishops even, that the reason they don't attack me is because they know it's the gospel. Forgive the arrogance that must sound like. But they know it's the gospel. You understand that Jesus said his Father's sun shone on the good and the bad. His rain fell on the just and the unjust. We know Jesus talked that way. Yeah? And so this dualistic mind, just in our heart of hearts, we know it isn't true. Now, in fairness to Catholicism, which I do critique, that it has a much more subtle moral imagination than Protestantism would tend to have. I don't know if you saw the recent movie Silence about the persecuted first Catholics in Japan. It's based on the novel by Shusaku Endo. Okay. Or if you ever read, now this is revealing my generation, but Graham Greene, his classic novel, The Power and the Glory. It's about the whiskey priest, an alcoholic priest in Tabasco, Mexico. And you just see the whole book is this man's failures, and yet you love him. He's a saint. Do you understand? Yeah, by the end of the book, you'd love to just hug the guy. Do you understand? That's the Catholic moral imagination at its best. I'm not saying we always had that. The typical parish on the corner in Southern California might not be teaching that. But in our great saints and mystics, you always find it, you know. This much more subtle, compassionate reading of reality. And I believe that's what the gospel leads you toward. I
want to go back to this time of around 12 or 1300 where can we call it is it the Catholic movement at this point, or the universal Christian movement?
In terms of the West, we're the only game in town.
Right.
So I should give you the second significant date. You've heard it in my classes. In 1054. Now, we have had two different parts of the empire. The eastern part identified with Constantinople, Istanbul. The western part identified with Rome. They were more Greek, we were more Latin speaking. So once you have two different languages, you create two different ways of thinking. There was always a lot of tension there. But once we had our crusades and went marching into the Eastern Empire, killing our fellow Christians, that ended it. You understand? And in 1054, the Patriarch of Constantinople excommunicates the Bishop of Rome, and I think a day later, or vice versa, I don't know who started it, the Bishop of Rome excommunicates the Patriarch. So the reason I say this is the great wholeness that Christianity enjoyed up to that point was cut in two. And basically we stopped studying the Eastern Fathers, they stopped studying us, we went toward imperial thinking, Holy Roman Empire, we called it now. So that's when we become the Holy Roman Catholic Church. But that's the only game in Europe, do you understand?
Right.
That's the only, if you're a Christian, you're a Catholic. Yeah.
At this point, what's going on in Syria, in Afghanistan, in China? What's their relationship to this, and how are we all one? If this is kind of our understanding of Western civilization and spirituality, in this understanding that we're all one, we're all connected, what's going on in the Muslim community, in the Buddhist community? How are we connected at that point?
Well, gosh, it's 1,000 different stories. But let me leave it at this. There's a lot more diversity. Like you speak of Syria, Armenia, you can go to every part of the Middle East. They all have their own independent Christian church with their own style of prayer and dress and liturgy and language and so forth. So anybody who tells you it was all uniform, it was never. It was never all uniform from the very beginning, you know. And even when I simplify it by Eastern Church and Western Church, there was great diversity. The church in France was very different than the church in Italy and Germany. So now, we probably have almost no contact, direct contact, with Hinduism or Buddhism. Now, Islam isn't around yet, you know. When it does emerge on the scene, that's why what happens by the time of Francis is this immense fear of this new religion that's taking over the Middle East.
Okay.
I mean, the anger and fear of Islam in the 12th century is very similar to what we're experiencing today. And again, this is why Francis is such a significant figure. He's the only known person. There's a movie out right now called The Saint and the Sultan, because it's documented. This is not Catholic mythology, that he made at least 2, maybe 3 trips from Italy, traveling all the way down through Palestine into Egypt, where the Crusaders were attacking the Muslims. And we always were told, well, he was trying to go to make those Muslims into Catholics. That's not true. Francis went there to tell the Catholics they were wrong in attacking the Muslims. This is now documented in 3 different historical studies and this new movie. So forgive me for talking about Francis so much, but
I'm drawing it out. So you keep going. It's fascinating to me.
He's was ahead of his time on issue after issue. First of all, he loves creatures: brother sun, sister moon, sister fox, brother water, sister air. The elements are all subjective. He's the first recorded person to ever grant subjectivity to animals and things. Now, that's no small thing, because that means we have an enchanted universe. It's not just, God is not just saving souls. God is saving creation. God is in love with creation. So thank God we made Francis the patron of ecology, because he had an ecological vision in the 13th century.
And
you just don't see that.
And that's he started to face some resistance or some heretical thing, because the ocean is not us. Like, we are above. God has put us and held us higher. Is that part of what caused?
Well, that's more Protestant thinking.
Okay.
He wasn't that way. I mean, the 13th century, you see this in Celtic Christianity. If you've ever been to Scotland or Ireland, look at the Celtic crosses. There's animals all over them. They don't have the body of Jesus. They have curly cues like you have hanging right on you. The whole world is wound together. I can't find a Celtic cross before the 15th century that has the body of Jesus on it. It's nature. It's covered with what they call Celtic knots and animals. So you just see it was a much more holistic worldview. Even the cathedral, San Rufino in Assisi, if you go to it, the whole front of it is animals. They saw in wholes. They saw things connected. That's how the mystical mind does. God wasn't just saving human beings. God was saving creation. Now that tradition was, you know where it was stronger? In the Eastern Church.
Eastern Church being?
Being the Constantinople East, the Greek, the Russian, the Romanian, and so forth. But we didn't study the Eastern Fathers. After we split, we didn't pay much attention. So no offense, but when the Protestant Reformation comes along 500 years ago, you're at best reacting to half of the pie. Do you understand? And then you subdivided and subdivided and subdivided, all dependent upon a written book, not upon what we call the first Bible, which was creation itself. Now, lest you think I'm a heretic, I want you to go back to the first chapter of the Bible And it says 4 times in a row on each day of creation, it was good, it was good, it was good, it was good. On the day of the creation of human beings, it says, and it was very good. So we start with original innocence. And the fall or the problem doesn't start till Genesis 3. But most Protestant denominations began with the fall, the problem. You understand? We got to solve the problem that we're all sinners. We're all sinners. So it becomes sin-based, sin-centered, and the overcoming of sin is the whole agenda. Pretty much the whole agenda.
What year is this that you feel like this became the new?
Well, pretty much when we moved from nature to written texts.
Okay.
Now, I'm still for the Bible. Remember, we need that critical orange level if you're into spiral dynamics. We need that critical thinking that the Bible brings. But when you spend your whole day reading books and no longer respect the land that you're walking on or the tree that's feeding you, you're in trouble. Do you understand? You've got a very small gospel. The Word became flesh, the early fathers said. Before the Word became man, it's no accident. John's gospel says the Word took on enfleshment, materiality, physicality. Do you see? So we gradually move away from that, where it's not God saving creation, but it's just saving human beings, and not very many of them at that.
Right.
It becomes more and more stingy notion of salvation. Talk about meritocracy.
Right.
They don't merit it. They don't merit it. They're not worthy of it. When we're all saved by mercy.
God's saving this exclusive fraternity of individuals who have gone through
country
this
club
system. Yes.
Christianity. Yeah, it's all exclusionary. Who can we exclude? I write about this in my book that I just finished. In the beginning, I'm sad to say this, but the scapegoat mechanism is so deep in the ego, so deeply embedded in the psyche, that already in the Bible you'll see the first hints of what become anti-Semitism. Soon we become anti-sinner, anti-heretic, anti-woman, anti-foreigner. The anti-energy is in the ego just waiting to be evoked. The early desert fathers would have called those demons, darkness, which they indeed are. But we became so identified with anti-energy, if I can play on the very word, and this wasn't malicious people, I'm not trying to be cruel, but we became more anti-Christ than Christ. In John's first letter, or is it the second? First letter, I think, where he says, anybody who cannot see that Christ came into the flesh is anti-Christ. Flesh is the giveaway. Can you see God in the incarnate world? That this is all the self-emptying of God. This is all the outpouring of God. What else could it be? I'm not some new ager. It was the scriptures. Since I got to throw scripture in to prove I'm orthodox, I want you to go and read the Noah story. The covenant Yahweh, the God of Israel, forms with Noah, and it's said 4 times in the text. I think it's Genesis 7 or 6 and 7. Is not with Noah, not even with his family, but with all of creation. Check it out. The covenant with Noah is not with an individual, it's with creation. How did we miss that? We were able to ignore everything and just take care of ourselves pretty much. And then, as you could expect, we didn't know how to take care of ourselves. And we became more and more known as an exclusionary religion.
And this exclusionary tribal religion, and this need for the anti-whoever, and you're saying anti-Christ.
Now it's anti-gay. It's
anti-gay,
it can be anti.
Refugee, anti-Trump, anti-Hillary.
Anti-Trump, too.
It's, that is our almost natural human instinct to go that way, which is what has led us so quickly, even from the early centuries, to violence and hatred as the answer.
Yeah. The literal transliteration of the words Satan, is the accuser. The accuser. Satan is the accuser. When you have an accusing instinct inside your soul, even against yourself, and I bet we've all faced it on particular days, that inner voice that starts accusing you, you're just, you're no good, you're an idiot, you're ugly, you're stupid. That's Satan. I mean, in terms of classic mythology, I don't care how you define Satan. It's all, let me throw this in right now. And you've heard me say this in class. The only language available to religion is metaphor, period. And I could defend that to the hilt. There's no other language possible except metaphor. And when religion doesn't know that, it always becomes idolatrous and arrogant. Mm-hmm. And that's why in the very giving of the name of God in the book of Exodus, Yahweh, which is formerly the unspeakable name for Jewish people, he will not reveal his name. Mm-hmm. God chooses to remain anonymous. I am who I am. You know it. Exodus 3:14. I'm not going to give you control over me. I'm not going to, because then you'll think you know who I am. Mm-hmm. It's brilliant. Right at the beginning of the Bible. So many of the major problems are solved right at the beginning of the Bible. But if you don't pay attention to them, let me give you another one. In the 4th chapter, Cain and Abel. You've all heard about the Cain and Abel. One was mirrored good, one was mirrored negatively. I talk a lot about mirroring in my work. Abel receives the father's blessing. Cain receives the father's non-approval. Mm-hmm. Cain, of course, kills Abel. So we're all set up with our dualistic minds to make Cain the bad guy, Abel the good guy. But you know what? Just keep reading about 2 more verses. But Yahweh marked Cain to protect him. He sent him to wander east of Eden. What a wonderful metaphor. He doesn't condemn him to hell. He doesn't hate him. But just to wander, that's the word that's used. To wander east of Eden. Mm-hmm. So, your own novelist here in California, Steinbeck, was clever enough to gather that and make a whole novel about east of Eden. We're all wandering east of Eden, mm-hmm. but we're marked with the mark of Cain. That even the so-called wrong one is protected by God. That is the beginning. They're right there, hidden away in the 4th chapter of Genesis, of the theme that I would now teach as restorative justice. Mm. Whereas the notion of justice that you and I were raised on is almost entirely 100% retributive justice. Quid pro quo, tit for tat. In fact, when you use the word justice on American news in the evening, everybody thinks retribution, vengeance, mm-hmm. basically. Mm-hmm. That's not the biblical theme. No. The biblical theme, starting with Cain, is God marks you for growth. Do you understand? Mm-hmm. Lets you wander east of Eden. No, he doesn't condemn you. You're still just a little outside the garden, but you're still close to the garden. You understand? It's brilliant. Just a little east, that's all.
Tasha introduced me to restorative love versus retributive love.
Yeah, same thing.
And my little mind had difficulty wrestling with that and creating a reality for how much that impacts all of our life. Are there any other metaphors or ways that you're able to explain retributive love versus restorative love you share that kind of opens people's eyes?
Yeah. Even the Jewish people, let me just backtrack a little bit, I'll get to your question. The Bible illustrates the 3 steps forward and the 2 steps backward. They're both in the text. And very quickly, the genius that we see in Genesis and Exodus already becomes legalistic and ritualistic by Leviticus and Numbers, which aren't real inspiring books, but they're still in the Bible. I'm not throwing them out. But they're very much quid pro quo. You must do this to please Yahweh. If you don't do the ritual in exactly this way, Yahweh will rain down fire on you. I mean, it's pretty much that bad. That's the way the ego works. The ego likes the economy of merit, of earning, of deserving, of basically the win-lose scenario of reward-punishment. That became heaven and hell in the Christian vocabulary.
And
Eventually.
the wrath of God became a very popular phrase, that we want to avoid the wrath of God that was written about in these Old Testament books in what seemed like a very logical fashion.
I know when I first attended some Baptist or evangelical services, I think the word wrath was in almost every song. As a Catholic, I could not believe they're really into the wrath of God, aren't they? Where did this fascination? Well, it's the only way to somehow bring justice to this world. Your minimalistic sense of justice. So now with backtracking, how we had it, how we lost it, the people who restored it, the deeper tradition, the wisdom tradition to Israel, are called the prophets. Now it was the Jewish prophets who really refined the notion of restorative justice. I wish I had chapter and verse here in front of you, but they're all through. The prophets will ream out the Jewish people for their phoniness, their hypocrisy, their wars, aligning with empires and kings and money and chariots, as they put it. And that'll sometimes go on for 3 chapters. You get tired of them speaking truth to power. But if you stay with the text, you will always see that it ends up with something like this. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to love you even more till you're capable of seeing what you're doing.
Unconditional.
Yeah, it's always there. This is why if you try to understand the Old Testament without the prophets, you're in trouble. Because you'll miss those Cain and Abel kind of stories. It's the prophets who bring back Israel to their home position. Because we all lose it, just like Roman Catholicism does, just like every Protestant denomination does. You get it, you lose it, you get it, you lose it. And normally to maintain it, you got to be honest here, you got to water it down to the lowest level of retribution. Then, see, if you can frame things, particularly for men, you know I do a lot of men's work. The male of the species, sorry to say, no offense, brother, but the male of the species, we prefer a win-lose frame.
Divide and conquer.
We love win-lose. I was just teaching in Denver a few months ago, and they told me they're about to build their 7th stadium. I'd love to know how much money they have for the homeless and for schooling, you know? I'd love to know. But isn't it funny? They will find money. It must be an exaggeration, but that's what they told me. A 7th stadium in one city, you know? Because once you can frame things in terms of win-lose, most people will buy into it. Maybe you heard me tell this story in class. It's true. When I was still in Cincinnati as a young priest, I was addressing a group of Catholic businessmen, a Catholic businessmen's breakfast. And I just threw out, I was just a kid then. I'm sure I had no authority to talk this way to these reputable, well-heeled businessmen. And I said, what if the gospel is win-win? What if it's not win-lose? What if it's not about heaven and hell? Because I said, I believe God wins. That's what it means to be God. God doesn't lose. God is victorious. And the evangelicals also sing about that, but their narrative is not very victorious for most of the world, you understand? So we don't believe it very much. The world doesn't, I don't think you're serious.
Was this received with some grumbling?
Yes.
Or was it received with, that's right, or that's...
Well, I could see the stirring in the crowd. You asked the right question. But the story I tell, and this is true, at the break, this well-heeled Catholic Cincinnati businessman come up and thumbed his fingers on the podium I was standing behind. And he said, Father, Father, in a very patronizing way. They got to respect the priest and call him Father. Father, Father, when, that wouldn't even be interesting. That's a quote. That wouldn't even be interesting. I realized his entire worldview was
deeply
informed
ingrained
by the business world, by American politics, and by the the money world. You know?
In our educational
Where it's all
system,
about winning.
I feel like,
It's all
I
about
feel like
winning.
as well, the educational system.
Yeah.
You're rewarded by getting the good grade.
Yeah.
That's why you work hard to study to get the good grade, and if you don't,
You don't.
you're receiving the low grade, the less value,
You got it.
the F, and you're not going to move on. And
A
so it's
win-
only interesting to win, to work hard to win.
A win-lose worldview needs losers. It mass produces losers. It has to call yourself a winner. You understand? Now, it's only the compassionate hearts like a Gandhi or a Francis, you know, or a Nelson Mandela or a Jesus who can see those things. Most of the rest of us who have totally situated our lives inside of win-lose,
Yeah.
we're sort of comfortable with it, as long as we're winning, of course.
Right.
And that's why the cross became such a central logo, the logo of Christian religion, because that's the hard sell. You know, to recognize that the normal way most human beings come to this compassion, to this universal thinking, is through suffering.
I'd
I haven't
love,
found another way. I don't know how to get people there any other way.
I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about suffering, about integrating the suffering into our lives, and how we have defined suffering in such a negative way. But in fact, it's the only way we grow.
It is. And people think you're being morbid or negative when you say that. But I haven't met a loving person yet who hasn't gone through significant trials. You know, and now, my definition of suffering is very simple. You've heard it. Whenever you're not in control, whenever you don't get your own way, whenever you're not steering the ship momentarily, you're suffering. Now, if you've steered the ship all your life and always been number one, always been Mr. White, heterosexual, perfect, you probably don't know very much, really. I mean, if you're always a part of the winning team. And so normally, and I talk about this in my book, Falling Upward, and also in Breathing Underwater, part of the deal, I mean, the Buddha says this too, part of the deal is there has to be some kind of pushback against this salvation project that you've created for yourself, this nice, ordered worldview. In the school in New Mexico where I teach, and this is going to sound almost naive, it probably is. I think I started teaching, you were in the first class, right?
Second.
Oh, then I did teach, I think I did. Did I teach you about the 3 boxes? No.
No,
No, it's only the 3rd class. God, they love this so much that now I'm teaching it. Picture 3 boxes. The first box is called order. The second box is called disorder. The third box is called reorder. Right? Now, and I could document this in Joseph Campbell's
The Hero's Journey.
I mean, in the native religion, summer, fall, winter, spring, you start easiest. Not everybody does anymore. I don't think most people do anymore. But the easiest journey is to start with some order, some definition of reality, some home base, some sense of basic meaning that tells you it's good to be alive, I'm good, God is good, you know, it's okay. It makes it so much easier. I grew up that way in Kansas, of all places, you know, on the other side of the Wizard of Oz. It couldn't have been a much more ordered universe. We were all Catholic, we were all white, we were all American, we lived in the heart of America. I mean, God just set me up.
You're at the top of the hierarchy.
Yeah.
And we thought everybody should be like us. What else could you think?
You wouldn't know any different.
You wouldn't know any different than that. Fortunately, I joined the Franciscans young, and soon after was sent to teach in poor countries, developing countries. I met all kinds of people in every culture, and I realized my little first box really wasn't the case. You were told a false narrative. This is not the shape of the world. I was thrown into disorder. Now, in Christian language, you don't have to use this language. That's what Paul calls the folly of the cross, right? The falling apart of your nice, ordered explanation. It has to happen. Now, let me stop there. A lot of people, millennials now, postmoderns, people who've been in any way abused, excluded, rejected, poor by any criteria, they begin in the second box. This is a much harder way to grow up, where from day one there is no order. I never knew who my dad is. I don't know if my mother is coming home tonight. Do you understand? It's
Very disorienting.
Completely disordered world, you know? Now, here's the thing. All religions are talking about getting us to the third box, reorder. But there's no non-stop flight from the first box to the third box. That's what conservatives think there is. That they can just keep staying in the first box. Ignore all the evidence to the contrary, you know. Ignore the fact that people are starving, all right? That our politics isn't working for everybody, that everybody isn't heterosexual, that everybody isn't white. Just ignore that. Keep ignoring it. Keep ignoring it, you know. You have to become very naive, and you have to live in a smaller bubble to conserve your worldview. I'm not saying that's true of all conservatives. There's a very healthy conservatism too. Now, what most liberal, progressive, sophisticated types do is just keep defending the second box. My definition of order is there is no order, and don't you dare try to put any on me. It's cynicism that I'm invested in. Do you understand? Cynicism as a way of life. Skepticism as a way of life. Laughing at Christianity, laughing at any religion, laughing at anybody who still has their mythological, tribal dances or something. Oh, these are superstition. You know. Actually, they might be working for those people. You're judging it from your later level, you see. And I know you understand this. So what second level people, the disorder box people, have to do, and this is hard for them. I was jail chaplain for 14 years in Albuquerque. And almost everybody in the jail was raised in the second box. And what they were all doing during their time in jail was trying to go back
to the first box.
Some order.
Yep.
The first box they never had. And they're all into fundamentalist Christianity, legalistic Christianity. Give me order. Give me explanations, and I can't take that away from them. I don't need it. I internalized order before I was 14. Lots of order, too much order. I know the laws. I know how to keep the laws. I know the meaning of the laws. I learned plenty of impulse control. I know how to be on time. Do you understand? I know how to be a good Boy Scout. So that for me isn't virtue anymore. That's what Paul is saying, by the way, in Romans and Galatians. If at that point you still think the law can save you, you're an idiot. Law is actually your problem. You become anal retentive. You become legalistic. We see this in false conservatism, right? People who are not in love with God, but in love with their laws and their rituals and their exclusions, whatever they might be.
Do you see this exacerbating? Is it getting more and more divisive as you've watched over from 1970 to 2017? Has this divide increased, or has it just kind of always been there, and now with the media it's blown up and made it more prevalent?
First, we want to say it's always been there. But right now you have to say both extremes are increasing. I can talk the way I'm talking to you right now, and almost wherever I can go in the world, I'll receive a ready audience and a standing ovation even. People are ready to think contemplatively, non-dually, wisdom, if I can use those words. And those crowds are growing, and the pushback is less and less. But also, on the other side, the pushback is more and more. The more we go 3 steps forward, the more the 2 steps backward increase their vociferous nature. And that's America today.
Where are you finding, sorry, hon, where are you finding the most friction, the most bump when you say this? I know Rob Bell released that book, Love Wins, which became very controversial because what do you mean there's no hell? And that's kind of been you've had that love wins all along, but it all of a sudden became something more legalistic and more controversial at that point. Am I right in?
If you've lived your whole life in the economy of merit, and let's just call it an economy, it is, right? It's a quid pro quo. I'm not comfortable unless I get payback, positive and or negative. You'd actually prefer a world of punishment. You'd feel good, beat me, because I need to undo my sin somehow. Do you understand? To be transferred to the economy of grace, and I'm talking Christian theology now, but is uniquely the work of God. There's the image in the book of Habakkuk, one of those Jewish prophets, that he's picked up by the hair and placed where God wants to place him. I think to be transferred to the kingdom of grace, normally you have to have found some issue in your life that you cannot resolve by your own dualistic thinking. Let's say, the example I've used for many years, I knew a good Polish Catholic couple, law-abiding, Mass every Sunday, obeyed the laws, and, they find out their oldest daughter is lesbian. They come to me, this 30 years ago. Father, what do we do? We love her. We know she's good. She's our daughter. We're not going to abandon her, but we know she's a sinner, so they're quite willing to call her a sinner. But their little dualistic explanation that was given them by low-level Catholicism, low-level morality, fell apart. Now, they went through an agonizing 3 or 4 months. But if you go back there today, they're one of the most loving, inclusive, compassionate, wise Polish Catholics on the scene. Do you understand? And you have to have a crisis. That's the folly of the cross.
And that crisis, that experience that they had, they were in their first box. That was their initiation.
That was their
into the second
box.
box. That was the disorder.
Right.
Wait a second. This doesn't fit in
It
our
doesn't
system. We love our daughter, but now she's not in our ordered box anymore. So now we're in disorder.
Could we have understood our first box incorrectly? Now see, if you're not a humble person and an honest person, you won't go there. You will hold on to your explanation, all evidence to the contrary. Even if it means rejecting our daughter, you understand, and becoming a hard-hearted person.
And that's all too prevalent.
This is what Jesus calls Pharisaism. It's in every religion. These are the people who killed Jesus. You are so invested in your explanation of black and white, true and false, that you lose your heart. You give up your soul. For the sake of your head, it's always localized in the head. Let me say that very strongly. Religion all moves up into the top 3 inches of your body, and faith is all head beliefs. And you will insist that God impose your order on the universe, and condemn lesbians to hell, because that makes you feel comfortable, I guess. I don't know why.
It was in your box.
It allows you to remain in your box. They can't see the narcissism in that, the intense narcissism, and the closing off, not just from the heart, but basically from the body. If you see such people, they're usually disconnected to their bodies and their heart. And I've always, as a Christian, if the Word became flesh, you would think we would have a really positive body theology, earth care theology. This is where God is hiding and revealing God's self. But we don't. We by and large don't. And so you can see heady Christians. They're usually disconnected, even resentful of any heart language or any body language. Very often anti-sexuality in general. And we Catholics did that first. I'm not blaming later Protestants on that. But unfortunately, you thought you were reforming us, and you largely repeated our worst errors in different form. Do you understand? Our worst errors.
And
because it's the ego, it's the same ego at work.
And these heady Christians, you said up here, you call them heady Christians, intellectual Christians, have scripture memorized from a logos standpoint, but not from this mythos, metaphor, storytelling ethos.
That's right.
You said something that I thought was really beautiful, and you punctuated it. You said, was it the Bible is metaphor, or religion is metaphor, Christianity?
The only language available to religion is metaphor.
Excellent. So on that, And I want to get to some of Tasha's ideas about the pillars of what she's learned from you. But to me, that spoke to me because as an artist, artists speak in metaphor.
Yes.
Music is metaphor. Painting is metaphor.
That's why we Catholics were not so stupid when we emphasized art so much.
Yes. And that's why I think so many people are drawn to the arts,
Yeah.
even though it's hard to pay the rent.
Yep,
It's
yep,
hard
yep.
to make a living. It's just a hobby. It's not a real job. But artists are drawn there because metaphor is an entire language for
Yes.
how we express ourselves. It's largely been repressed.
That's right.
That was my connection
Well,
that I saw when you said
thank
that, and
you.
that's such a channel into spirituality is even through the arts, because the arts are an expression of metaphor.
No. You know, metaphor is from two Greek roots that mean to carry across. A metaphor carries you from here to there. And that's what good art does for you. It's what good music does for you. You know, there's a recent book by Ian McGilchrist, The Master and His Emissary. It's probably bigger than you care to read. But he just affirms what Einstein almost identically said. He said there are two minds. The rational mind, which historically was the emissary, and the intuitive, creative mind, which was historically the master. You started there, and Einstein says we have turned them around, and the emissary has become the master, and the master the emissary. And Einstein said this is killing us. Now, Ian McGilchrist, if you care to read this, he documents how that's happening. You know, that the rational mind has no capacity to feed the heart or the body or the soul, only the mind, and that in a very limited way. I'm not against the mind, but I'm for integrating it. I don't want to use my mind, but you can't let the emissary, the rational mind, become the master. It takes over, and the way it takes over is it divides the world into pairs of opposites. That's what we mean by dualistic thinking.
I wrote this down in my notes, and you were speaking extemporaneously at one of your conferences. And can you just say that again, where we've switched it around, and it used to be the logical mind used to be the responder to.
That's right. To the big intuition. Now that was when we moved forward with myth and story and art. We didn't, the rational mind only begins to take off in the 12th century again, right when Francis is trying to save us and to not let us lose it. But we needed to go there. We needed to become logical, critical, rational. So I'm not saying it's wrong. It created the scientific revolution, the medical revolution, the industrial revolution. We're sitting here in a beautiful building because the rational mind won out.
It gave us healthcare. It gave us education. It gave us an easier way to live. However, we lost some of our intuitive soul, and that logical mind became our master, and the intuitive, emotional, metaphorical mind became subservient to this logical mind.
You got it. And now it's been pretty much controlling the ship for 500 years. 500 years. It's almost simultaneous with the invention of the printing press. Do you understand? We go completely
Gutenberg.
Up here, 500 years ago. And everything is rational, logical, and thank God for it, but it's no longer helpful in this position of being the master. It has to go back to being the emissary of the deeper intuition, the deeper wisdom, the intuitive mind.